Welcome to the Southampton Education School Research Seminar Series. I am Achla Gupta. I'm a lecturer and program coordinator of our seminar series. Our events are open to all. We aim to facilitate meaningful conversations and contribute to advancement in the field of education. Thank you so much for your interest in this event. I hope you enjoy it. Please feel free to visit our website for details about our upcoming events.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming today. I'm going to be pretty rapid. I've got a kind of text that you can take at the end, two texts in fact, and if you don't, I think I've got enough, but if you don't, you can write to me and I'll send you a copy. I'm going to be pretty quick, as I say, because I've got quite a lot to say. The structure of this is reproduction, this book that we have, and its background and key themes. But rather than just go into the kind of detail of the epistemology and methodology of it all, I wanted to situate it a bit in the context of its influence in British English educational research, and kind of interweave that a little bit with interpretations of the book, shall we say. It's what Bourdieu would call a sociological history of the past or a historical sociology of the present. So it's trying to read a text and talk about a text in its kind of socio-historical context. It's a gloss. There's a lot more to say about all the things I'm going to say, I'm going through pretty fast. Anyway, this is the book in question. The origins of this talk was a paper I did a chapter I did in a French publication, because it's 50 years since this publication. And here it is. It came out in 1970, La Reproduction. In those days, Bourdieu was not Bourdieu. And it took 7 years to be translated. Even then, there are issues of translation that we can go into. For example, the French one, it says élément pour une théorie du système d'enseignement, not in the English version. So the accent is often kind of shifted one way or the other in French translations of Bourdieu's work. Anyway, to situate its context, what you get in reproduction is very odd in some ways. It begins with book one and book two. The first one is 70 statements that are almost come across as aphorisms. This is the educational system, 70, a lot of them. And then book two, more empirical exemplification. Kind of like not the normal that you often expect in educational research, where you get the kind of analysis, the empirical analysis, and then the kind of distillation of conclusions. So that in itself was a bit odd, in a sense. Why did they do it like that at the time? And as I say, they are numbered, these 70, but it doesn't start with one, it starts with naught. And it says, this is the first statement in the book, every power to exert symbolic violence, sorry Christian, every power which manages to impose meanings and to impose them as legitimate by concealing the power relations which are the basis of its force, adds to its own symbolic force to those power relations. Nothing about education in a sense. It's very apposite to what's happening in America at the moment, in fact, this comment. But this is the thesis. It's about schools and, pedagogy and symbolic power and, the democratic schooling. And Bourdieu's thesis overall, of course, is that what's happening in school is a kind of social reproduction of social hierarchies or class. And for a statement, all pedagogic action is objectively symbolic violence. These are quite, slap in the face statements. You might even disagree with them, of course, but that's what you've got in this book, insofar as the imposition of a cultural arbitrary by an arbitrary power. So, the vocabulary of this sort of stuff, it's very French, it's very continental, it's very radical, very critical. You might not like it, but that's what it is. I just wanted to say that as a result of this book, Bourdieu became the cultural capital man. When I was training to teach in the 1980s, Bourdieu, you mentioned his name, the cultural capital man. What did he mean by that? He wasn't quite perhaps the first, or other people working in this area, but this idea that you know, if you make a democratic school like a comprehensive school and you say, okay, now we're democratic, everybody is treated equally. But if people enter that school with different cultures, then a kind of self-selection works. Because some are more ready for the culture of schooling than others. Before this time, sociology of education in this country was very statistical and really just set, you know, analyses of performance according to, you know, gender groups, social groups, things like that. But this was one of the first books it was getting, hang on, there's something happening in schools that are not really as democratic as they would appear to be. I mean, Bourdieu had been working on this stuff for quite a long time. It came out, the English version, in 1977. 1964, he'd published Les Héritiers. And in 1972, there had been this book, Knowledge and Control, with the so-called new directions in the sociology of education, the new sociology of education, knowledge and control. So there was already a lot of interest now in, you know, the construction of knowledge in classrooms, shall we say. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. So Bourdieu, in this book, had two papers, two articles that came from French papers. These are the French dates. So already by the mid-60s, he was working on this type of stuff. One was called Systems of Education and Systems of Thought, and the other was called Intellectual Field and Creative Project. Incidentally, this was the first time that, you know, people often think of Bourdieu's field theory. This was the first time he used the word field to look at social institutions in terms of field. And I mean, it's analysis of the same type of thing, really, about, I mean, it's almost the kind of, idea that, is it the way we think that constructs the world? Is it the world that constructs the way we think? I mean, this is kind of like one of the philosophical things that it's never totally solved, but that's what he was trying to get into about, you know, how is knowledge constructed in education and pedagogy, and what happens when in learning and teaching. He wasn't the only one. I mean, Basil Bernstein, the English sociologist, was working on a similar lines. In fact, you know, the idea of this book came from a conference in Durham where they were talking about these things. And Bernstein was already developing this notion of codes in education, that there were restricted codes and elaborated codes. Bourdieu was very critical of this language in the same ways that you know, the kind of cultural differences that you have in schooling are not restricted. They're very sophisticated. They're just not quite the ones of the ruling culture within an educational system. And also the way the curriculum was structured, classification and framing. But even outside of sociology, there was people like Douglas Barnes working on language and learning, you know, studying classrooms, the law of 2/3, looked at classrooms and was already analysing the idea that in a classroom, 2/3 of the time is talk, 2/3 of that time is teacher talk, and 2/3 of teacher talk is questioning. You know, and then the whole analysis of open and closed questions. There's something that you can do in classrooms, and there's something about the culture of classrooms that's characteristic. So we are talking about the 1970s at this sort of particular point. The context, I wanted to say, was obviously the growth of teacher training and teacher education. In the early 60s, you didn't have to qualify to be a teacher. Increasingly, you did. The Institute of Education was an enormous influence. I mean, it had been knocking around since the early part of the century, but a new building opened, as some of you have been there, in Russell Square. And it became, you know, the place, the mecca for education. Bernstein was there, of course. And then educational theory, English, you know, the work of the philosopher Paul Hirst, you know, kind of counterposed itself to, again, that kind of very instrumental utilitarian view of theory and practice that you had in the 1950s, philosophers like O'Connor, and the so-called foundational disciplines. And, you know, this came from the general culture. I mean, a lot of autonomy, of course, in those days in education came from the culture of education at the time. But the Mecca, the institute was the place where this was really, pumped out, and the so-called foundational disciplines of sociology, psychology, history, and philosophy. So you ended up with this sort of kind of relationship to, originally it was just the kind of normative sciences, psychology, etc., intelligence tests, relationship to practice. But people like Hurst are saying, out of all of this, you can develop educational principles, which he called educational theory. And that actually, in practice, teachers develop their own theories anyway, which he called pre-theoretical or fundamental pedagogic theory. A lot of teacher thinking, another field of research, was very much predicated on the kind of fundamental theories that teachers developed in their teaching, shall we say. And the philosophical resources for that tended to be phenomenology, people like Vandenberg and things like that. So a lot of thinking about the relationship between theory and practice. Paul Hurst, as I say, and if you were training to teach languages, like I was trained to teach languages, you were kind of articulating your own pedagogy. How should I teach it? Should I teach it according to language laboratories or communicative language teaching or whatever? And, sort of examining and exploring the relationship between what we knew about language learning from educational research in terms of theory and what I was going to do in the classroom. So these were kind of burning issues. In terms of sociology itself, again, a big rise. It wasn't a terribly sexy subject for the early parts of the 20th century, but certainly after the war, there was this rise in, the whole part of the explosion of the communicative systems in the 60s and things like that people began to interrogate sociology and that whole sort of culture of kind of criticality, shall we say. The Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Birmingham was incredibly important. They were into people like Gramsci, an Italian Marxist. This was a radical atmosphere. The ILEA, the Educational Authority in London, was also, radical and critical, multicultural. There was a kind of mood of anti-schooling, really, or anti-education, that in the light of all this stuff, that something needed to be done. Well, what could be done? There was notions of deschooling and schools are bad. Not quite the flavour of, parents these days, that we're going to join some sort of cultural revolutionary movement. They know we want performance now, we want our kids to do well. But, what do you do when you start believing that schools themselves have a pernicious effect on individuals? Well, I argued that there was three ways of tackling it, because I could see three ways of tackling it. One was resistance, the kind of cultural war, early cultural war. One was to celebrate it, quite a lot of that in ILEA in London at the time where I was working. And another one was positive discrimination, so you select out the kind of ones that don't quite have the culture that they need to have, and you give them tuition to get them up to stand. Obviously, none of them really work, which is a bit sad, but anyway. I put these up just to say, these were if you go to the library now, these are the sorts of books that you would see in education departments, Power and Ideology and Marxist Perspectives on the School of on Sociology of Education. This was the mood of the times, shall we say. Education in Power, Michael Apple, some of you would have heard of him, very influential sociologist. And more in terms of the English situation, people like Len Barton, Sociological Interpretations of Schooling and Classrooms, of Reappraisal. And this seminal text, Learning to Labour, by Paul Willis, which is, very interesting. It came out in 1978. He did a piece of real ethnography. He kind of lived with the lads. He called it the lads. He went out and kind of did some undercover ethnography. And what is the culture of these lads that drop out of schooling fairly early on? And he had this famous phrase that's on the back of the book, the mystery about why is it that working class kids allow middle class kids to get all the best jobs. Is why do they let them? Why do they let them do this? Was his, what happens was his question. This book is interesting in the sense that it's again divided into two books. The first part is sheer ethnography, just him describing, and it's worth reading. I mean, it's fascinating, you know, the dialogues of these kids, these lads, and what's their attitude to schooling. The second half of the book is very theoretical, very Marxist, in fact, based on Marx's Grundrisse, and where he talks about cultural penetration. And he says, and I saw it myself in schools, and he said, well, there is a moment, and it need only be a moment, where these lads kind of go, school is not for me, you know, and everything connected with language and learning becomes an alien territory for them. I certainly saw a lot of that in schools in London when I saw it, when I was working there. Interestingly enough, although it came out in 1978, to show the influence of Bourdieu, he hardly mentions it, Bourdieu is mentioned once, I think, en passant. So Bourdieu was still to kind of make a penetration into educational radical research. I just want to put this up to say, you know, what happened as a result of this culture. And I'm not arguing that everyone followed Bourdieu by any means, but he was part of that kind of movement and part of that argument and part of that dialogue. And what you did get in the 1980s, at least, is a kind of embracing of a lot of the techniques that were around in qualitative ethnographic research. So, you know, there are books, I'll show you in a moment, on classroom ethnography. Helen Simons, who was professor here, and still emeritus professor here, action research, CARE in Norwich, the Centre for Action Research there, grounded theory, case study research, symbolic interaction, classroom-based research. You know, the kind of qualitative paradigm was very much to the fore, with a kind of undercover, with a kind of search to uncover what was really going on in classrooms in schools, shall we say. In a phase two, which I would call kind of 80s, going into the 90s, you know, a lot more kind of critical philosophy became, you know, postmodernism was in the air, Foucault. I mean, when I first came here, everything was a discourse. You know, everyone wanted to talk about, well, that's a discourse from Foucault. So it became a kind of, you know, deeply critical and more philosophical in a continental way. The Reflective Practitioner, Donald Chun's book in 1984, was incredibly influential. You know, that teaching was about reflecting on your practice, and epistemology of practice, he called it. Knowledge about practice. No, knowledge in practice, knowledge of practice, you know. And, you know, by the early 90s, all teacher education was reflective practitioner. In other words, you went out and saw your students, they taught a lesson, and then you got them to reflect on it. And so reflective was terribly utilitarian. I mean, there's much more critical versions of reflexivity. So I just put up these kind of books that are still around on my desk. Controversies in Classroom Research. Martin Hammersley was a very influential ethnographer in educational research. You know, educational research in action. Lots and lots. The center of the Open University's online courses. This is the Donald Chun book, The Reflective Practitioner, terribly influential. But there were critics. It was in the second period of Margaret Thatcher's tenure as Prime Minister that they really got going with education, with Keith Joseph. And increasingly there was a critique about schools. It wasn't helped by a lot of teacher strikes in the 1980s, I should add. But Sheila Lawler, who was a kind of, you know, right-wing writer, David Hargreaves, who was within the culture, was a ex-teacher, educational researcher. I mean, he's famous for saying, we want more research about if you do X instead of Y in the classroom, there's an improvement in results. You know, it started getting very kind of basic, you know, the education research doesn't deliver. Michael Barber, we want more statistics. So, you know, this was mounted like a lot of things now in the press and everywhere, shall we say, increasingly as the 80s went on and the 90s. So when I came here in 1989, this kind of just was sort of just happening, really, shall we say. And what hit me first of all was the national curriculum. We'd not had a national curriculum before. In my first year or two when I was here, with my training modern language teachers, I did whatever I wanted. No one actually asked me what I was doing. No one inspected me or anything. You Then came the reactionary Backdash, this paper, 992. Kenneth Clarke, as education minister, grabbed hold of education and teacher education and said, right, we are going to take control. And this is the first one that said, teachers need to spend 2/3 of their time in schools. So this became much more kind of involvement and this began the kind of idea that this is an activity that will be monitored and surveyed and inspected and da 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 da. So there was that. This kind of what gave us the teacher training agency at the time and the teacher development agency at the time, and of course at that time also, my slides are a bit out of sequence. Anyway, remember that blue one. There were political initiatives. The 992 Ofsted was set up, ran about that period. The national curriculum was set up. I remember the first year I was here, we were consulted about the early plans of national curriculum. They don't do that anymore. Teacher training agency. The Tooley report in 98, which is this, completely kind of attacked educational research as we then knew it. Said that it's kind of wishy-washy, it doesn't, nobody reads it, it doesn't affect what goes on in schools. And worse than that, you have a lot of people that are in love with French philosophers. This kind of phrase was, imagine in the Times, this was put up. And as a result of that, the National Educational Research Forum was produced. And this kind of agency, again, all government agencies, were produced to kind of take control. Suddenly they took control of journals, funding, anything to do with research, the SRC, anything. They took control and said, okay, we are going to stipulate the type of research that you can do. Of course, what had happened previously in universities generally in 1986, the first research assessment exercise. They were just reporting on that when I arrived here. So, the idea that I've just been writing about this with the project I'm doing with Christian and Michael, that actually, the idea that universities were fairly autonomous was being lost in front of your very eyes. From then on, it wasn't okay money to you, it was how much money you get according to how efficient and how successful you are. And this idea, built into, as with schools and league tables and God knows what else, this philosophy, the National Educational Research Forum, as they say, kind of, produced its own criteria. And I went to an Ofsted thing and they said, this perfect idea. If you set the criteria for inspection, people will perform to it. And this is true. That simple principle animated everything, both in schools and in universities from then on. Going back to Bourdieu and reproduction, people say, well, it's deterministic. And Passeron wrote this, one must be aware of taking a model of social reproduction as a comprehensive model of society, as a law or trend which appears to regulate the order of historical evolution. What he's trying to say is that, there's a lot of kind of, shift and creativity within the system. It's just the general sense of this model. They are approximate models of what's happening. Nobody is ever saying that if you go into school as the son of a miner, you're going to come out a miner. And there's plenty of examples of people that don't. But somewhere along the line, this tends to be it's misrecognized as such. If it was as deterministic as that, it'd be revolution. But the fact that some people succeed and well, so they've succeeded, so everybody can. It kind of justifies the status quo, shall we say. So what Bourdieu is very often talking about is kind of, trends and patterns and results, rather than, one of the first things about critiques of Bourdieu was, well, it's all deterministic, isn't it? It's not deterministic. And the other thing that's perhaps a bit more contentious, Bourdieu could see that the teacher can't really do much about this, yeah? So it's impossible to imagine a teacher able to maintain with their own discourse, their pupils' discourse and their pupils' relation to their own discourse, a relation stripped of all the indulgences and freed from all the traditional complicities. What sort of teacher could do that in the classroom? without at the same time crediting them with the capacity to subordinate their whole pedagogic practice to the imperatives of perfectly explicit pedagogy, whatever that is. All the time that I was involved in modern language teaching, it's been contested. So it's not like do this and it will work. I'm sure that's true of a lot of pedagogies that you've come across. I think the point is here also, I mean, the work of Jill Bourne that was here, which was fairly scary, was that even when she kind of researched a really progressive teacher, you know, really all the progressive techniques of real books and group works and things like that. And this progressive teacher, if you had a pupil that didn't kind of fit in with that progressive agenda, they were excluded, you know. I mean, even, it wasn't like it was some nasty kind of reactionary pedagogy that was imposing itself. That even when a progressive teacher tried to kind of be, you know, more open-minded, etc., the same system reproduced itself. So generally, the systems were very pernicious and very difficult to get hold of. And the idea that a teacher on their own could do much about that was to be questioned. I just want to move on a little bit to say something more about Bourdieu, and what I'm moving on now to say, was Bourdieu really a sociologist of education? Was Bourdieu really a sociologist? I would argue that he probably wasn't. But the point I'm making here is that, you know, his interests weren't just on education. You know, he'd done a lot of work before he ever became known in this country in education, on museums, culture, lots of work in Algeria, lots of work in the Béarn, and was a philosopher as well. I mean, was reading people like Bachelard, Merleau-Ponty, Ganguillaume, you know, quite sophisticated. In fact, there's a film on YouTube where he's talking about epistemological vigilance, you know. I mean, who would talk about epistemological vigilance these days? Well, you know, let's talk about epistemological vigilance, you know. And there he is in the mid-60s being very... And he's interested in patterns of domination and symbolic power, you know. And, you know, that sort of research came from observation very often now with students and researchers. And they're going to be, you know, go and look at what you're interested in. Just look at it. See what you see. You know, forget all the reading and the literature review. Just look and, you know, use your intuition and use you. So Bourdieu was also against the idea, again, of the independent researcher, you know, who's kind of objective and distant. You know, use your own intuitions. So these two pictures I often use. He was a photographer. Bourdieu took lots of photos. One on the left is a Christmas ball in his own village. And he goes there and he's watching everyone dancing, and there's this group of men on the edge and they're not dancing. And you can see him thinking, well, why are they not dancing? What's happening to those men? And then in Algeria, where he did his national service, again, who are these young guys that turn up? Well, you know, there you have all these kind of Arabic dress, and you know, these guys turning up in sort of modern suits and, you know, little commerçants, they're selling things. Who are these guys? There's voluminous work from Bourdieu on these people, you know. He uses any kind of method he can get hold of, statistics, ethnography, interview, the whole bloody lot. But you can see what he's interested in, really, at the end of the day, is patterns of domination. That domination is not just imposed from above, that it's preceded by integration. And that, you know, that integration represents a kind of imposition in a way of certain principles that lead to a monopolization. So, you know, if you can kind of integrate and if you can bring in principles that you are declaring to be universal, like democratic schooling, then you will dominate and you will monopolize. And this is what he is trying to say in these books about the way that power works within systems. It's not simply a domination. An imposition, sorry. And again, you can see this everywhere, really, not least the university system. Anyway, his first book, Theory of Practice, 72, 77, talks a lot about this. But this is where he's trying to kind of, you know, for Bourdieu, most of his work is practically orientated. He starts with a practical context. But he's using his work here, this is a photo he took in Algeria, to kind of distill theory out of his practice, of the practice he observes, you know. And he'd written books on art and museums, un art moyen, l'amour de l'art, un art moyen is about photography. So, not really, shall we say that education was just one institution that he was interested in terms of the French state and studying the French Republic. Epistemological vigilance on page 3 of Outline of Theory of Practice. He says, Bourdieu talks a lot about rupture and breaks and refusals, and he's saying, well, we need to break with empirical knowledge, we need to break with phenomenological, we need to break from, in fact, we even need to break from scientific knowledge. So this is why it's an epistemological mission, What is the knowledge that comes out of this process for Bourdieu? Now, certainly as teachers and then as kind of aspiring educational researchers, this was quite esoteric. What the hell does this mean? What does it mean to break from something? What does it mean to kind of... And Bourdieu talks a lot about this, about how, his own studies, when he went back to the Béarn where he came from, he felt a great sense of shame and betrayal because suddenly he could see what was really going on. And incidentally, the unmarriable men were unmarriable because it would cut into the kind of legacy rights of the children. And, the French inheritance laws that it wasn't that the eldest got everything, it was that they divided it up. So after a few generations, what you had is farms kind of en miettes, what they call it in French, completely broken up. And so the grandmothers mostly organized it so that some people just didn't get married. They were unmarriable. And of course, you have that first sense with Bourdieu of social suffering, that your social context and situation can lead to a lot of psychological suffering. It leads right up to La Misère du Monde, The Way to the World in the 1990s, where he's talking about the same thing in contemporary France. So there's also a lot of talk about objectivism and subjectivism, which is the most ruinous of all the divisions in research, Bourdieu claims on the first page of The Logic of Practice. And again, in the paper, I say, if you want one word you want to kind of meditate on, it's structure. And people have heard me talk and say, oh, you're a structuralist. No, Bourdieu is talking about this dialectic, about structures that are structuring and structured. I mean, the Berger and Luckman book, The Social Construction of Reality, was very influential, this idea of externalization of internality and internalization of externality. So Bourdieu words, a science of dialectical relations between objective structures and the subjective dispositions within which these structures are actualized and which tend to reproduce them. How do you develop that science? How do you present that science? How do you undertake that form of science? Because one of the key things is, of course, reflexivity comes into it. The first thing you interrogate is your own classifications. So thinking tools, I don't want to go into great detail about this, but probably some of you have heard this, that habitus, field, capital. Just remember, these are epistemological matrices. They are not metaphors. And, people often say, oh yeah, I know that, habitus, a biography, field, well, context, capital, anything that's valued there, reflexivity, yeah, I do all of that. But Bourdieu's concepts here are coming from, deep kind of epistemological considerations, shall we say, in terms of research and the researcher. He talks about the ontological complicity between habitus and field, about how you create and you are created as part of the same ethos. At the end of the day, sometimes when I speak to English sociologists, you don't get Bourdieu. Why don't you? Why don't we get it? Because you don't understand le moral, the moral force. You don't understand that. There's this kind of it's a philosophy of invisible. Cultural capital. There's 3 forms of capital: cultural capital, social capital, economic capital. Economic capital, straight money. Social capital, your network connections. Cultural capital. Bourdieu argued, and I think it was true, in the post-war period, this was particularly powerful in France and certainly in this country too, the explosion of universities and things like that. It's not enough now. Cultural capital is not enough. There's plenty of people with PhDs, with quite humble jobs, and things have moved on. So there are issues there. And what is true of concepts is true of relations. What he's looking for is relations, which acquire their meaning only within a system of relations. So, when you're looking at something, you're looking for relations and structures of relations, yeah? They have no definition other than systemic ones and are put to work empirically in systematic fashion. So such notions as habitus, field, and capital can be defined, but only within the theoretical system they constitute, epistemological. I mean, very fast, Bourdieu did a lot of publications, early ones on Algeria and the Béarn, then the stuff on education and culture in the mid-60s, and then what I call the great ethnographies, anthropologies of France in the 1980s, and further kind of epistemological, methodological books, Leçons sur la leçon, choses dites, Ontologie politique de Martin Heidegger, Ce que parle veut dire, the only book he wrote on language. And then this sort of last period, which is much more socio-politically orientated, La Mesure du Monde, looking at social suffering in French society. And he's looking at the economy and masculine domination and reflexivity, and he's getting into art, Manet and Flaubert and things like that. So you can see the expansiveness of his work at that time. In terms of methodology, 3 phases, construction of the research object. If you embrace the research object as it is given within the discipline, you're already buying into an orthodoxy. So he's asking you for a kind of reflexive critique of the very thing that you're studying and the orthodoxy of the field. A field analysis, and then participant objectivation, where the tools of analysis are brought back to the researcher. And then field analysis, 3 levels, the field, education. Oh, that tells me to shut up. Or at least it gives me 5 minutes before shutting up. So, yeah. Field education, habitus, those involved in the field, and the field in the field of power. What I found generally, and I've examined lots of theses, as you can imagine, on Bourdieu, is that people tend to do 3. They do biographical, normal ethnography, and then they try to Bourdieuize it. They don't look at the kind of relations within the field that they're looking at, whether it's a secondary school or university, and they don't really look at the way those structural relationships from the field of power versus curriculum and policy affect what you do. Huge examples of that in England, the Michael Gove's reforms of what you can and cannot study in schools. Huge imposition of from the field of power. Anyway, trying to connect the 3 is often not really done. So, my general conclusions, he's not really a sociologist of education. He has a doubtful influence on pedagogy, other than a changing ontology. And at one point, I don't know if I wrote it here, but I argue that Bourdieu's is an epistemology that becomes an ontology. In other words, you as a researcher become transformed as part. You are not the objective kind of, this is my science and this is science, but you too. This is why my book, I call it Metanoia, a new look on the world. As I say, doubtful sociologist, epistemology. He's anti-individual studies. He's always looking at networks. What is it to know? What is this science? If you do, what do you know at the end of it? What is it to know? It changes your relationship to it. So, my overwhelming conclusion, Michael has heard me say this, is it all depends on the nature of the relationship between the subject and object. What is the nature of that relationship? If you interrogate not the relationship, but the subject relationship, he's interested in symbolic power. He's more interested in the institution of the state. He wrote a book on academic discourse, but he never really did any language, research in the classroom. So he is interested in the dynamic power. He is an ethnographer. He accepted towards the end of his life, the Huxley Prize in Anthropology. Those early anthropological works that he did were still very rich to him. He's interested in holistic relations and social suffering. And he writes, sociology would not be worth anything if it did not return to men and women the meaning of their actions. So this is a very kind of continental political stance to take. That somehow what he's offering you is something that kind of disclose what's really going on. Not only in your research subject, but within you yourself. So someone said to me, "Well, is Bourdieu a guru?" And in a way, there is that element of it, and then there's like, oh, is this psychoanalysis? that people, I mean, there's a lot of kind of Vygotsky in Bourdieu as well, as I say, it's very continental in a way. I've written what one of the professors in the department said, oh, have you written anything that's not about Bourdieu? I won't name names. Ignoring all my work on applied linguistics and teacher education. But I have written quite a lot about Bourdieu, and these are some of the books that are around on kind of an intellectual biography, work on language ethnography and education, from also using the work of the new literacy studies people that have used Bourdieu. There's a book on educational in Bloomsbury series in their library. And then this book that I did in 2023, which is Metanoia, which is my latest book. If any of you want a copy of this book, I can give you a PDF if you write to me. Don't tell the publisher, but I do have a PDF. I could give you a copy of which is my latest pronouncements on this. There's two papers here that I've printed out. One is on reproduction in Great Britain, 50 years after, which is a kind of the text, the English version of the French one that I wrote. And also this one, which is an interview with me. It was published in South America, but again, it's the English version, which, if you're that interested, you can take a copy. And also, as I say, I mean, if any of you are interested in Bourdieu and want to discuss some more, then get in contact, and I'm available. Thank you.